Welcome to Let's Thrive Postpartum, where we tackle postpartum depression and anxiety head on, guiding you back to yourself. Join Kelly Siebold, founder of Thrive Postpartum, and Ashley Moore, a maternal mental health therapist. Through honesty and laughter, we share expert advice and real stories. While not therapy or medical advice, you'll find education, support, and hope. Welcome to the village. Let's thrive postpartum.
Hi, and welcome back to Let's Thrive Postpartum. I'm Kelly.
And I'm Ashley.
Ashley, how's your morning going?
You know, it's pretty good. I think the sun is shining today compared to some previous days, and it's Friday, so got some good things happening. I think it's
good.
How about you?
Same, excited. We're recording this right before the weekend, and so getting to look forward to the weekend is so much fun.
Yeah, it really is.
But so that's kind of our fun part before we get into something that's a little not fun, but a little bit more challenging, I guess is the way to say it. And something that I'm sure every single person listening, whether you're a mom or you're not, or you're trying to be, or you're a spouse or a partner, negative thoughts. I think all of us as human beings just tend to think things that we're like, ooh, that wasn't good, or ooh, that didn't feel right.
Yeah.
Ashley, can we jump into negative thoughts, what they are and what do we do with them, especially in early motherhood today?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Ooh.
And I think too, as a heads up, like we'll kind of put this into the context of cognitive behavioral therapy. So anybody out there, if you've ever read about CBT or heard CBT, or if you've been in therapy and that kind of thing, CBT is just kind of a theoretical orientation that some therapists use. And I use it sometimes. It has lots of very practical homework type things. So sometimes when I have a client that's like, I want homework, I want exercises, I want very concrete things to work on, I'm like, okay, well, let's bring in a little CBT. And it can be really, really helpful with negative thoughts.
So can we, in that moment, if you use this as homework at sometimes, obviously if you're listening, you don't have to do homework, but if you do like doing practical skills and walking away with some actions, Ashley, can you walk us through at the end a couple practical things like you could give to listeners so we could try it if we wanted to after we heard this?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Love it.
Definitely. So I guess I'm going to I'll start quickly with what like CBT is, just so you can think about it. What it is in a nutshell, if you can envision a triangle, or if you're watching this, I'm like making a little triangle with my fingers. It's basically the idea that our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are all interconnected all the time. And so they call it the CBT Triangle, and each point is one is thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And there's arrows sometimes we draw that kind of go back and forth between each of these feelings. So example being, let's take Kelly, give me a negative thought. What's a negative thought that's come up for you?
I will never sleep again.
I will never sleep again.
Right. You have a newborn. I will never sleep again.
So we take the thought, I am never going to sleep again. What kind of feeling comes from that thought?
For me, it was dread and just overwhelm and sadness and exhaustion. Like it was just a very deep, sad feeling.
Right.
This is my life.
This is my life, you know? And so then you can think like, all right, what are some behaviors that could come out of that kind of feeling, right? If it's like a sad, you know, like despair kind of feeling, some of the behaviors that come out of that are like, you know, not wanting to get out of bed, right?
No.
Like we're talking about depressive things, like not wanting to get out of bed, not wanting to engage in things when you're stuck feeling that kind of like in that sad space.
Mm-hmm.
Some people with lack of sleep describe feeling super anxious. So the feeling that comes out of I'm never going to sleep again is anxiety. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to fall asleep when you're super anxious.
It's terrible. It just makes you stay up more.
So then the behavior that comes out of anxiety is not sleeping or having an even harder time sleeping, which of course is then going to feed back into I'm never going to sleep again. So you get stuck in a loop sometimes of I have a negative thought that leads to a negative feeling. often leads to a negative behavior that reinforces the negative thought that we had in the first place.
And so I can see it just keeps going around and around and getting worse.
Going
and
around and around.
Deeper and deeper.
Right. So in CBT, what we would want, we would say, all right, let's identify those three pieces. Now let's talk about some ways of like interrupting one of them so that we can say, okay, I've had this negative thought and I've realized, right? You have to have the awareness. I realize that I'm having this negative thought. I'm never going to sleep again. We would then talk about reframing it, challenging it, like trying to do all these different things to turn that thought around or replace it with something else. Like, you know, I am having a hard time sleeping right now because my baby is a newborn, but this isn't going to be forever, right? Something that maybe instills more hope or instills a different feeling, because then you're more likely to have a positive behavior when you have like a positive feeling. And so it's not always interrupting the thoughts. Sometimes we say it's too hard to interrupt the thought. We're going to try and interrupt the behavior. So when you notice, I haven't gotten out of bed all day today, you challenge that behavior by forcing yourself to get out of bed. And
sometimes that's easier to do than others.
Sometimes, right? Yeah. Or it might be, you know, like just making yourself choose a slightly different behavior, because that is then probably going to enforce a more positive feeling, which is going to lead to a more positive thought. So it kind of just depends where you are and what's going on with a person. Where can we like jump into that triangle and give a different option? So I think the interesting thing with negative thoughts is like there's all these different ways that our brain has negative thoughts, and they actually have names. They're called cognitive distortions.
Okay. Fancy sounding.
I know. And if you guys are seeing here, I have this whole like sheet right here that I recently found, I think probably from grad school, because I never throw anything away. And so I think it could be interesting to kind of just go through some of these things that are called cognitive distortions, because we're going to recognize every single one, but probably not realize that there are all these different named ways that our brain makes life harder than it needs to be sometimes.
Well, let's do it, because I think when you think of negative thought, I always think of something really extreme. I'm never going to sleep. To me, doesn't seem like a negative thought. That just seems what life is. Right. So I'm really interested to see what our brains are doing to make us have negative thoughts and for us to identify them.
Yeah. So I'm never going to sleep again might be something we call overgeneralizing. I'm never going to do something again, or it's always going to be this way, right? It's like using these big, broad statements when you're like if I was to say literally, Kelly, you're never going to sleep again in your entire life. You're never going to sleep again.
Of course I'm going to sleep again. My body will shut down.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So another one
in that world. Yeah. Overgeneralization.
So another one is thinking about like, this is sort of similar, like all or nothing thinking. This is like the black or white thinking. Like I am, I always fail, or I'm only a good person when this happens, or, having these big like extremes. If you ever notice big extremes in your thinking, you can be kind of like, I think that maybe like, this is a cognitive distortion. I might need to think about this, like, about it again. Minimizing. So like, yesterday was really like, we had such a good day yesterday, or yesterday was so much fun, but your brain is like, I know, but like tomorrow's probably just going to be awful. Or yeah, today was great, but yesterday was like the worst day ever,
So looking at something and being like, oh, what's coming next is going to be worse.
What's coming next, or trying to minimize, right? If say you woke up one morning and your husband's like, oh my gosh, like the baby slept through the night. And you're like, yeah, but she didn't take her nap yesterday. Right. So you're minimizing a success, or you're taking something that is good and you're making it less good because, this happens because of anxiety, because of depression, because of, that kind of thing. Jumping to conclusions, predicting the future. I kind of just did that one a minute ago, right? Like, well, I bet tomorrow is going to be like this, or I bet, you're making assumptions
about the future.
Yeah. Shoulding is if you notice lots of shoulds, right? I should be doing this. We should be doing that. I feel like I, as a mom, should be doing X, Y, and Z, or my kids should be, doing this developmental leap or whatever like that at this point. Anytime that you feel like you're saying lots of shoulds, I always have people pause and say, what is a different way that you could say that? Because should, I think we've talked about this before.
We have.
It feels so like you're blaming, right?
Judgy.
It's judging. Or like you're taking on too much, right? I should be doing this. Like it makes you feel guilty. It makes you feel bad. I haven't really quite found a way of using should in a way that would make someone feel better.
And I feel like I am very aware when I say should because of your conversations that you and I have had, right? Because you're true. It's very true. Yeah. It's very judgy. Yeah. Like you should have done this. Like, how dare you not do it? Or I should have done it, right? There's a lot of I's in that when we think about motherhood. I should have been a better mom, or I should have done more.
I know.
Judgy.
So that's a big one that moms, I mean, I hear moms say it and I say it all the time, but I do catch myself now because I've said it so many times, like, hey, try not to say should, that when I say it now, I'm like, oh, let me say that in a different way. Another one is, like mind reading. Like, I know that person thinks that I'm a bad mom. They must think that I'm the worst because of doing this. Or, I think that they're judging me because my baby's doing this right now. Like mind reading. It's basically you're assuming that you know what someone else is thinking, which we don't.
We don't.
But we say stuff like that all the time. Mm-hmm. You must think that I'm the worst. You must think that I think it also leads to a lot of over apologizing. I think I know this in myself. Sometimes I'll see something and I'll apologize, like for my kids' behavior, or I'll apologize for something that I've like feel like I should have done here, have done better. And it's because I'm assuming that the other person is thinking something negatively about me. And maybe they are, but maybe they aren't, Yeah.
I think it's very normal.
Personalization. So this is making things your fault, right? Like it's in your head, like it's my fault that my baby didn't sleep through the night, or it's my fault that this or this didn't happen, like making it all about you. And one of my favorite things to ask myself, and that I ask clients sometimes, and sometimes I'm more direct depending on who I'm talking to, but I'll say in a situation, like if it's causing lots of anxiety or and I'm like, is it possible that what's going on in this situation actually has absolutely nothing to do with you? Like absolutely, absolutely nothing. That happens a lot in interpersonal things, right? You're like worried about what someone, like the way that they've said something to you, or the way that they've interacted, or the way that they're, or it's like a fight between friends, or it's like siblings or parent, right? And I'm like, it is possible. We can probably say it's possible that you're having a reaction to something that has nothing to do with you, but you're kind of like putting yourself in the middle of it. So that's kind of like what personalization is. Catastrophizing. We're all familiar with that one. Yeah. Assuming that the worst possible thing.
Also live in that area. That tends to be my go-to.
I live in that area a lot.
Not healthy. Yeah.
A whole lot. Like that is the what ifs, right? So anyone with anxiety, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if that happens? Actually, the other day, my 6-year-old got stuck in this what if loop about something, just completely outrageous, out of the realm of possibility. And he gets like that sometimes. And I can tell he gets himself worked up. And I said, well, what if a dinosaur comes and visits your school today? I was like, or what if a spaceship lands outside your classroom? He's like, well, that's not going to happen. And I said, but it could though, right? He's like, no. And I said, are you sure? Because what if a marching band or something flies in on a banana into your classroom? And he's like, what? But I was like, but buddy, some of the things you're saying, it's the same thing. Like it really is definitely not possible, or so like very, very unlikely to happen, that you can sometimes challenge and get yourself out of that loop by saying something completely silly and ridiculous, just to challenge that what if. Mm-hmm. Sometimes laughter is a good antidote to some of these things. Labeling is one, right? Like I'm this one has, it's like, I'm a loser, he's a jerk, I'm a bad mom. If you're trying to say I am something or this person is something and you're kind of putting a label on it, that often is it's a cognitive distortion. It might be covering up what you really want to say is like, I feel guilty about what happened, or I'm really angry at this person because of what they said, but we say he's a jerk.
Gotcha.
Instead of saying how we are actually feeling about that person or about that situation. Disqualifying the positive, right? So that's like, it doesn't matter that baby slept all night. They might not sleep, they may never do it again, right? It's kind of just discounting what's going on. So yeah. And there's a couple more, but those are like, is all these different ways that our brain kind of misinterprets a situation. I think often in a way to mask or prevent us from saying how it actually makes us feel, because that's really hard.
It is, especially if you are a new mom and you're struggling and all the mental health things are hitting with anxiety or depression. Saying how I feel can feel so overwhelming or even just hard to comprehend sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's one of the hard parts, I think, in motherhood is the honesty piece. Like, how can you be honest sometimes about how you're feeling? Because, and I guess this could be interesting to say, is Kelly, what do you think about saying that there is a difference between having like negative thoughts and saying, though, that you're having a negative feeling, right? You can like to say like, I feel sad, or I feel disappointed in myself, or I feel frustrated that this is like the situation that we're in. That's different than having a negative thought.
It is. It seems somehow more objective and less personal to say I'm feeling this than to have it internally be a negative thought to me.
I feel like too, I mean, kind of like just thinking on the fly here too, is like, that is, I think the feelings though, you could say like that is more true. Like that is true. If you really pay attention to how you feel about a situation, that is, at least for me, I can trust my feelings, because I know that sometimes I cannot trust my thoughts because my thoughts get anxious, right? Like,
interesting.
And so I think a lot of people with anxiety, and I was talking about this the other day with somebody, is like, once you have anxiety, you're like, well, I feel like I can't trust myself anymore because I've overreacted to a situation so many times that like what I was thinking wasn't actually what happened. So they're like, I don't trust myself. And I'm like, well, but sit with that for a minute, because think about something in motherhood that you really do know that you're good at, or you excel at, or a part of it that you really, really enjoy. There's something for everyone. Yeah. And like sit for a second and think about how you feel inside when you think about that piece of it. And you feel warm, right? And you feel calm, and you feel good, and you feel confident. And I'm like, that is true. Like that feeling is true. And so sometimes with anxiety and depression, like the hard part is you have to figure out and separate, like my thoughts sometimes may not be true, but can I connect with a feeling of something that feels really good? And that we know is true. It's kind of hard to like trick yourself into having like to feel good about something that's actually like not good, right? Yeah. Or like when you really enjoy something and if you try and be like, oh, I feel awful right now, like I feel tired and depressed when you're doing something that you actually love, your body's kind of like, no.
It's easy to trick yourself into the negative, but it's harder to trick yourself into positive, it feels like.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it is, you kind of negative thoughts, we do have to remind ourselves like that these are thoughts. And often, like sometimes our thoughts they're not true.
So can we take that, Ashley? We just went through so many different, which I tend to live in a lot of these places like most people.
Same.
Wouldn't have also realized they were negative thoughts, some of them, to be honest. So if we, knowing kind of what some of these are, can we go back to the cognitive behavioral triangle that you mentioned and say, okay, if you've identified it, can you walk us through some practices of what we can do when we're like, oop, negative thought? What can I do next before I start spiraling, like we kind of talked at the beginning, and it just keeps coming that shame loop or continuous loop of feelings, behavior.
So sometimes when people, I as a therapist don't do a ton of like homework. That's just not my style. But when people ask for it, CBT is one of those things. There are lots of worksheets and there are lots of things that people can like physically hold. And so one of them is basically like a thought log where what you're trying to do is like gain some awareness around what are my negative thoughts or what are my unhelpful thoughts. And when you realize that you have one, you write it down, and then you write it down in one column. And then on the next column, it says like, well, how can you challenge this? Or like, what is a reframe to this negative thought? And then you write down, right? Like if your negative thought is like, I'm a terrible mom, the reframe for that would be like, this moment's really hard, but I know I'm a good mom, right? Or it could just be, I know I'm a good mom. Today was really hard when the baby skipped their nap. Something that challenges it or reframes it in a way. And then sometimes it'll say, now note, how did you feel after the first thought, right? Probably a negative.
Probably negative.
Now reframe it, say it to yourself again. How do you feel after saying the reframe? And because what you're trying to do, and it takes a while, which is what gets frustrating for people, but you're trying to rewire the way that your brain thinks.
Okay, so just stop right there for a second. Yeah. So you do this once, it's not going to fix it.
No,
this is kind of like an ongoing, like muscle memory, long time process. That's good to know because you can be like, oh, I failed at this. I tried it, my brain goes back.
You've got to do it over and over again. One of my favorite things, and you being from the South too, you'll like this analogy, is I tell people sometimes, I'm like, imagine that you're driving down a really old, like muddy dirt road, and you've been driving down the same driveway for 20 years, and it's rained a lot, and it's been baking in the sun, and the ruts in the road are really deep. But you just drive on it because it just takes you from point A to point B. That's the road you've always driven on. You've never had any other reason to do anything different. Well, one day you buy the lot next door and you want to build a house. And suddenly you have to have a new driveway that comes off of that dirt road and goes to the new lot. Well, how easy is it going to be to turn out of a dirt road that is like has foot deep ruts?
Yeah.
Real impossible. You have to kind of stop and turn your truck and like get out of it and take the new road.
The Southern girl in me is like, I completely understand this.
I know it really resonates with lots of people here. And so you have to do it over and over and over again, very slowly, very manually, like very intentionally, until you have a new path that just kind of naturally forks off. And our brains are the same way, because when we get stuck in these more negative and unhelpful thought patterns, most of us have had them for years. Like it didn't just happen, right? Like when you had a baby, like a lot of times you're like, no, like I always have had these kind of negative assumptions, or there's a lot of stuff that I've done. So our brain though, it's stuck in a path. And if you want your brain to have a new way of thinking, you have to manually work at it and manually like change and take a different path many, 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 many times before your brain is like, this is now the path of least resistance. Now we can go this way. Does that make sense?
It does. And such a great analogy. And also motivational, right? Like you're not going to do this once and suddenly you think more positively. This is over and over and over again, but it will get there and it will get easier and keep going. To me, somehow is a little motivational that there's hope on the other side. Don't give up.
Yeah. Don't give up.
Even if that's not your normal feeling.
I know. Well, and as anybody like in therapy or kind of that goes into self-help kind of stuff, it does take a while. It takes a long time for some of this stuff to really work and for your brain to adopt a new way of thinking. I like to preface that because I'm just like, it is like, I'm such a visual person that I need like a way. I'm like, what do you mean? Like it takes a long time. Like, what does that even look like? And for some reason I went to a dirt road. I'm from South Carolina. So
I'm from the South. It makes great metaphor for me.
Yeah. So thinking back to some of
Okay.
these things. So the thought log is a good one, right? Where
Okay.
you are writing down, maybe you sit down and, at some point and you're like, all right, can I think back through my day? What are some of these like negative thoughts that I had? Or sometimes like you can print out this list. If you type in Google cognitive distortions, it'll give you a list and you can sit down and be, all right, which one of these have I had today? Or more likely, which of these did I have 400 times today?
More like, yeah.
And you literally write them down and you're like, this was my negative thought and this is the feeling that it led to. Sometimes you can identify a behavior, right? That's our CBT triangle. Sometimes that's a little bit harder, but a lot of times you can say, well, I didn't do this, or I did this instead, right? Like I didn't go on the walk that I had planned on going with a friend. I canceled on them. And that was a result of me feeling not so good. And I was feeling not so good as a result of this thought that I had. So you're trying to identify these patterns in your day of like, how is all of it connected? And then you create a new pattern, right? Like in that moment, you may not be able to, obviously, we can't rewind the clock and tell yourself that you're going to go on a walk, but you can pretend and you can say, all right, well, if in that moment, if I had this thought instead, you kind of write down the challenge to your thought or write down a reframe. I'll talk about, there's a bunch of different things that you can kind of, sometimes you have to do like some fact checking if you're making some assumptions, but you write down the reframe, write down, well, how does it feel saying this? It's probably a more positive feeling. And then if you want, you could say, well, would this have been more likely to lead to a more helpful behavior? And you could write that down if you want. And so a lot of it is like writing down and you're identifying these patterns. A lot of people, it helps to like write stuff down and kind of, it gives you something to do and like something to answer. So a lot of people find some help with that. Some of the other ways of challenging these things are, one of them, like we just said, reminding yourself that, sometimes these thoughts are not facts, and sometimes even feelings, right? Even the feeling, you can say this feeling might not be a fact if it's a result of this negative thought that I had. You can think about the likelihood, right? If you're like, oh my gosh, what if this happens? You kind of roll that back and you say, well, is it likely that this is going to happen? And sometimes I'm like, look up the statistics. If there's something you're worried about, right? Like look up statistics of it. Is this likely? Is this not likely? Is there somebody you can talk to that you trust, like a doctor or somebody else where like you can, sometimes facts and information satisfy anxiety and help it quiet down because you're trying to like get some more information. You can like say, look for the evidence, right? I'm the worst mom ever. Well, what's the evidence that you're the worst mom ever? Like, I'm like, well, did you feed your baby today? Yes. Did your baby have dry diapers? Yes. Did you have some cuddles and some snuggles? Yeah. Did you, when they were crying, did you soothe them and they eventually calmed down? Yeah. Maybe not every time because, kids,
babies. But you tried, the effort was there.
So it's like, okay, so then what's the evidence that you're the worst mom ever? And normally there's might be one thing, right, that happened that day that, well, I yelled at my kids. Okay, but look at all the other stuff that you did, right? If you were in a courtroom and that's the evidence you're presented with, which one's going to win out, right? So it's sometimes you have to bring back in that logical part of your brain that is like, let me look at the evidence. Let me get some information. Let me get some facts to try and challenge that negative thought. You can make lists of positives. Sometimes with people, something I've done before personally is make a timeline. Like if I feel like, not even necessarily related to motherhood, but it's like, what am I doing with my life? I'm like, well, I'm going to make a timeline of everything I have done with my life, all the things that I've done, all the accomplishments that I've had. And you kind of write it all out and you're like, oh, I've done a lot. I'm pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So there's so many different ways of challenging these negative thoughts. You first just have to become aware that you're having them and be able to start identifying them and be like, that was a negative thought.
Yeah. Ashley, this is so helpful, especially all the emotions and hormones and everything are happening at that early motherhood time. Even as your kids get older, this can just come up so often. I know it can come up for everybody, but in this situation, being able to say that was a negative thought, I think is a huge skill set that I wish all of us have or could keep building, because you're right. That's the first step to saying, I'm going to think differently. I'm going to behave differently, is knowing this is a negative thought and it's common and you can think differently.
No, so common. I mean, everybody has negative thoughts like every day. If you have older kids, my son and I, a couple weeks ago, I don't know if they were talking about negative and positive thoughts at school or something, but we kind of ended up getting in this game where he was pointing out when I would say something negative, because I realized there were things that I was like, oh my gosh, we're probably going to be late now. And he would be like, that's a negative thought, Mom. And I was like, you're right. I was like,
right. Yes.
Here's what I could say instead is we might be late, but we might also not be late.
Yes. We're going to see what happens.
And so he started calling me out on it. And then he would say things and I would be like, is that a negative thought or a positive thought? And he'd be like, it's a negative thought. And I'm like, all right, well, how can we turn that around and make it something a little more positive? And so you can bring your kids into this too, because it's sometimes it's really amazing what they notice in us. They notice stuff in us, but that we don't even notice in ourselves. And it's really funny sometimes because he was picking up on things that I was like, just random, like, oh my gosh, this is taking forever, or like, why is the pickup line at the pharmacy taking so long? And he was like, that's a negative thought.
That's adorable. But also what a great thing to have another person help kind of mirror back what he's learning, and for him to learn this at such a young age, becoming a habit of let me not make that rut down the bad way so deep that we talked about, but how do I instead turn it? Great skill set to start teaching your children.
I know. It's really funny. So kids they love becoming like parts of this, and it's a good lesson for them too.
Well, Ashley, thank you for walking us through all the different ways that we are doing this on a regular basis, every one of us, ways to kind of start changing once we've identified what those are. And if you like homework, there's some great activities you can try, or you can just think about it in your head as you notice it. And Ashley, I really hope that you have fewer negative thoughts this week. I'm going to have more because I'm going to be identifying them. So to me, it's going to be like, oh, that's it. So I'm going to spend a week being aware a little bit more.
Well, and that's the whole part is the awareness. Like sometimes people are like, I feel like I'm having more negative thoughts than I normally do. And you might be, or it might be that you're identifying them. So they're kind of just at the top of your consciousness, but you have to be aware of them if you ever want to do anything about it. And so just, you keep going, and soon your brain gets into more of this pattern where it becomes the unconscious pattern to be like, that was negative. Let me reframe. Now I feel better, moving on. And it just happens automatically instead of you sitting there and talking to yourself like I do. So
that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll see you next week. Here's hoping that you have fewer negative thoughts and you're more aware of them when you have them this week.
I know. Bye, guys.
Great. Thanks. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please be sure to hit subscribe, leave us your feedback, and give us a 5-star review. For even more support, visit us at wethrivepostpartum.com/podcast to sign up for our newsletter and learn more about our community. Remember, you are not alone. With support, you can feel better. Together, let's thrive postpartum.